The morning sun cast long shadows across the military training ground as Sarah Martinez adjusted her combat boots one final time. At 24 years old, she had already proven herself as one of the most dedicated soldiers in her unit. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her green eyes held the determination that had carried her through 2 years of military service. Today marked the beginning of advanced survival training, a grueling 3-week course that would test every skill she had learned. Sarah's husband, Captain Michael Martinez, was a helicopter pilot stationed at the same base. They had met during basic training and married just 18 months ago. Michael often joked that Sarah was tougher than most of the men in his squadron, and he wasn't wrong. She had consistently scored in the top 10% of her class in every training exercise, from marksmanship to tactical maneuvers. The training facility was located in a dense forest area about 30 miles from the main base. Sarah and 15 other soldiers had been transported there by truck early that morning. The group included both male and female soldiers, though Sarah was one of only 3 women selected for this elite program. The course was designed to simulate real combat situations, including prisoner of war scenarios and escape techniques. Sergeant Williams, the lead instructor, gathered the group around a large map spread on a wooden table. He was a veteran with over 20 years of experience, known for his tough but fair approach to training. His weathered face showed the marks of countless field exercises, and his voice carried the authority of someone who had seen real combat. "Listen up, soldiers," Sergeant Williams announced, his voice cutting through the morning air. "This training will push you beyond your comfort zone. You'll face situations that test not just your physical abilities, but your mental strength and decision-making under pressure. Some of you will want to quit. Some of you might actually quit. But those who complete this course will be ready for anything the real world throws at you." The training began with basic survival skills. The soldiers learned to build shelters using only materials found in the forest, how to purify water from streams, and which plants were safe to eat. Sarah excelled at these tasks, often helping her fellow soldiers when they struggled. Her natural leadership abilities didn't go unnoticed by the instructors. On the 3rd day, the real challenges began. The soldiers were divided into smaller groups and given different scenarios to work through. Sarah found herself paired with 3 male cadets, Thompson, Rodriguez, and Blake. Thompson was a cocky 22-year-old who had made it clear from day one that he didn't think women belonged in combat training. Rodriguez seemed more open-minded, but often followed Thompson's lead. Blake was quiet and kept mostly to himself. Their first mission was to navigate through enemy territory and reach a designated checkpoint without being detected. The instructors had set up various obstacles and enemy positions throughout the forest. If caught, the soldiers would face interrogation scenarios designed to test their ability to resist pressure and protect classified information. Sarah's group moved carefully through the thick underbrush. She had studied the map thoroughly and suggested they take a longer route that would avoid the most obvious paths. Thompson immediately disagreed, insisting they should take the direct route to save time. The tension between them was obvious, but Sarah remained professional and focused on the mission. "We need to stick together and follow protocol," Sarah said firmly as they paused near a small clearing. "The instructors expect us to make smart tactical decisions, not rush in without thinking." Thompson rolled his eyes and muttered something under his breath that made Rodriguez snicker. Blake looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Sarah chose to ignore the comment and continued studying their surroundings. She noticed movement in the trees ahead and signaled for the group to stop. "There's an instructor positioned about 50 meters ahead," she whispered, pointing toward a cluster of pine trees. "We need to circle around to the west." The group followed her suggestion, and they successfully avoided detection. As they moved deeper into the forest, Sarah's tactical skills continued to prove valuable. She spotted several more instructor positions and guided the team safely around them. Despite her contributions, Thompson's attitude toward her only seemed to worsen. When they finally reached the checkpoint, their group was the second to arrive. Sergeant Williams noted their successful navigation and commented on their teamwork, though Sarah could see the frustration in Thompson's eyes. She suspected he was angry that a female soldier had essentially led their mission. That evening, as the soldiers gathered around the campfire for their meal, Sarah overheard Thompson talking to some of the other male cadets. His words were quiet, but she caught enough to understand that he was questioning her presence in the program and making inappropriate comments about her abilities. She decided not to confront him directly, knowing it might create more problems. The next few days brought increasingly difficult challenges. The soldiers faced simulated ambushes, had to survive on minimal food and water, and underwent intense physical training. Sarah continued to perform exceptionally well, often outperforming her male counterparts in problem-solving exercises and endurance tests. One particular challenge involved crossing a raging river using only rope and basic equipment. Several soldiers struggled with this task, including Thompson, who nearly fell into the water. Sarah had grown up near a lake and was an excellent swimmer. She not only completed the crossing quickly but also helped two other soldiers who were having difficulty. Thompson's resentment toward Sarah grew more obvious each day. He began making subtle comments during training exercises, questioning her decisions even when they proved correct. Rodriguez and a few other cadets started following his lead, creating an uncomfortable atmosphere within the group. Sergeant Williams and the other instructors noticed the tension, but decided to let the soldiers work through it themselves, viewing it as part of the training process. They believed that learning to function as a team despite personality conflicts was an important skill for real combat situations. On the 10th day of training, the soldiers faced their most challenging exercise yet. They would be captured by mock enemy forces and subjected to interrogation techniques designed to break down their resistance. The exercise was meant to prepare them for the possibility of being taken prisoner during actual combat. Sarah knew this would be a crucial test. She had studied prisoner of war protocols extensively and was confident in her ability to resist interrogation. However, she was also aware that some of her fellow soldiers might see this as an opportunity to get back at her for her success during the previous exercises. The mock capture took place during the early morning hours. Sarah and her fellow soldiers were detained by instructors playing the role of enemy forces. They were separated and taken to different areas of the training facility for individual interrogation sessions. Sarah was placed in a small, windowless room and left alone for several hours. This isolation was part of the psychological pressure designed to weaken prisoners before interrogation began. She used the time to mentally prepare herself, reviewing the techniques she had learned for resisting pressure and maintaining focus under stress. When the interrogation finally began, Sarah found herself facing two instructors who played their roles convincingly. They used various psychological tactics, including threats, false information, and attempts to make her feel isolated and hopeless. Sarah responded exactly as she had been trained, giving only her name, rank, and service number. The exercise continued for 2 days, with each soldier facing multiple interrogation sessions. Sarah maintained her resistance throughout, never breaking character or revealing any of the mock classified information she had been given. Her performance was exemplary, and the instructors noted her strong mental discipline. However, not all of her fellow soldiers were handling the exercise as well. Thompson, in particular, seemed to be struggling with the psychological pressure. During one of the group sessions, where all the prisoners were brought together, Sarah could see that he was becoming increasingly agitated and unstable. The 3rd day of the prisoner of war simulation began with an unexpected twist. The instructors announced that the prisoners would be moved to a new location deeper in the forest. This was part of an advanced scenario that only the most elite training programs included. Sarah and her fellow soldiers were loaded onto a truck with their hands zip-tied behind their backs, continuing the realistic simulation. The truck bumped and jolted along the rough forest roads for about 30 minutes before stopping in a remote area surrounded by tall pine trees. The soldiers were ordered out and marched single file down a narrow trail. Sarah noticed that some of her fellow trainees were showing signs of serious stress. The extended role-playing and psychological pressure were taking their toll. Thompson walked behind Sarah in the line, and she could hear him breathing heavily and muttering to himself. During the interrogation sessions, he had become increasingly hostile, not just toward the instructors playing enemy roles, but toward Sarah herself. She suspected that his frustration with the training was being directed at her, possibly because her strong performance was highlighting his own struggles. The group was led to a clearing where several trees had been marked with red paint. Sergeant Williams, still playing the role of an enemy commander, announced that this phase of the exercise would involve psychological manipulation tactics used by hostile forces to break down prisoner morale and unit cohesion. In real prisoner situations, he explained in character, enemies often try to turn prisoners against each other. They create conflicts and exploit weaknesses to break down group solidarity. This exercise will test your ability to maintain unit loyalty under extreme pressure. What happened next caught everyone off guard. The instructors announced that they were implementing a new scenario where the prisoners would be subjected to additional stress through isolation techniques. 3 soldiers would be selected for special treatment designed to create fear and uncertainty among the group. Sarah immediately sensed trouble when she saw Thompson whispering urgently to Rodriguez and Blake. The 3 had been spending more time together lately, and their attitude toward her had grown increasingly cold. During meals and rest periods, they would stop talking when she approached, and she had caught them staring at her with expressions that made her uncomfortable. The lead instructor announced that the prisoners would now participate in a survival of the fittest scenario. Each soldier would be given different challenges, and those who failed would face additional hardships. Sarah realized this was designed to create competition and mistrust among the group, classic techniques used to break down prisoner unity. Thompson volunteered his group for the first challenge, which involved building a shelter that could withstand a simulated storm. The winning group would receive extra food rations, while the losers would face reduced supplies and additional physical challenges. Sarah found herself assigned to Thompson's team, despite her preference to work with others. As they began gathering materials for their shelter, Sarah noticed that Thompson, Rodriguez, and Blake seemed to be working on a plan that didn't include her input. When she suggested modifications to improve their design, Thompson dismissed her ideas without consideration. The tension that had been building over the past week was now becoming openly hostile. "Why don't you just let the men handle this?" Thompson said with a sneer when Sarah pointed out a structural weakness in their shelter design. "Maybe you should focus on cooking or something more suitable for women." Rodriguez laughed nervously while Blake looked away uncomfortably. Sarah felt her anger rising, but forced herself to remain professional. She knew that losing her temper would only make the situation worse and potentially affect her training evaluation. "We're all soldiers here," Sarah replied calmly. "The only thing that matters is completing the mission successfully. Our shelter won't pass inspection with that support beam positioned incorrectly." Thompson's face reddened with anger. The stress of the training, combined with his apparent resentment toward Sarah's success, was pushing him toward a breaking point. The psychological pressure of the prisoner of war simulation had affected his judgment and self-control. As the day progressed, the situation continued to deteriorate. During the shelter inspection, their design failed exactly as Sarah had predicted. The structure collapsed when the instructors applied pressure to test its stability. Their team received the penalty of reduced rations and additional physical challenges. Thompson blamed Sarah for their failure, claiming that her suggestions had distracted the team from his original plan. This was clearly untrue, as Sarah had barely been allowed to contribute to the construction process. However, Rodriguez and Blake seemed willing to go along with Thompson's version of events. That evening, as the soldiers settled into their individual sleeping areas, Sarah noticed Thompson talking quietly with several other male cadets. Their conversation stopped abruptly when they saw her approaching. The atmosphere in the camp had become tense and hostile, with clear divisions forming along gender lines. Sarah tried to focus on her training objectives and ignore the growing animosity. She knew that maintaining professionalism under stress was part of what the instructors were evaluating. However, she also recognized that the situation was escalating beyond normal training tensions. The next morning brought the most challenging phase of the prisoner simulation. The instructors announced that individual soldiers would face interrogation sessions designed to exploit personal weaknesses and fears. These sessions would be more intense than anything they had experienced so far. Sarah was selected for the first individual session. She was taken to a remote area of the forest and subjected to psychological pressure techniques that pushed the boundaries of training exercises. The instructors used information from her personnel file to create scenarios designed to break her mental resistance. For 3 hours, Sarah endured questioning that challenged everything from her military competence to her personal relationships. The instructors playing enemy roles were skilled at psychological manipulation, and Sarah found herself fighting to maintain her composure and remember her training. When the session ended, Sarah was exhausted, but proud that she had maintained her resistance. She had followed protocol perfectly, never revealing classified information or breaking character. However, the experience had drained her both physically and emotionally. As Sarah was escorted back to the main camp, she noticed that Thompson and his allies were watching her with expressions that seemed more personal than professional. The hostile looks and whispered conversations were becoming more frequent and more obvious. That afternoon, while Sarah was resting between training exercises, Rodriguez approached her with what seemed like a friendly conversation. He asked about her interrogation experience and appeared sympathetic to the stress she was under. Sarah was initially grateful for what seemed like a break in the tension. However, Rodriguez's questions gradually became more specific and personal. He wanted to know details about her emotional state, her relationship with her husband, and her plans for the remaining training period. Sarah began to suspect that this conversation was not as innocent as it appeared. When Rodriguez asked if she was considering dropping out of the program, Sarah realized that Thompson and his allies were testing her resolve. They wanted to find weaknesses they could exploit to pressure her into leaving the course. This realization made her more determined than ever to complete the training successfully. Later that evening, the instructors announced a new scenario that would begin the following day. The prisoners would be moved to an even more remote location for the final phase of training. This would involve escape and evasion exercises where soldiers would need to avoid capture while navigating back to friendly territory. Sarah was actually looking forward to this phase of training. Her skills in navigation and survival would be valuable assets, and the individual nature of the exercise would allow her to avoid the group dynamics that had become so problematic. However, as she prepared her equipment for the next day's challenges, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The looks and whispers from Thompson's group had taken on a more sinister quality, and she had the unsettling impression that they were planning something beyond normal training competition. That night, Sarah lay in her sleeping bag listening to the sounds of the forest around her. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl hooted softly, and she could hear the distant sound of running water from a nearby stream. Despite her exhaustion, sleep was elusive as her mind raced through the events of the past few days and her concerns about what tomorrow might bring. The final phase of training began at dawn, with the soldiers being transported to the most remote area of the forest they had seen yet. The escape and evasion exercise would test their ability to navigate back to base camp while avoiding instructor patrols acting as enemy forces. Each soldier would be released at a different location and expected to reach the rendezvous point using only basic survival skills and equipment. Sarah felt confident about this challenge. Her navigation skills were excellent, and she had consistently performed well in individual survival exercises. As she was driven to her starting point, she reviewed her route options and planned her strategy for avoiding detection. The instructor dropped her off near a small stream deep in the forest. Sarah was given a basic compass, a small amount of food and water, and 15 minutes before the hunt would begin. She quickly oriented herself and started moving toward what she calculated was the correct direction to reach the base camp. Unknown to Sarah, Thompson had convinced Rodriguez and Blake to participate in a plan that went far beyond the boundaries of legitimate training. His resentment and frustration had developed into something much more dangerous during the psychological pressure of the extended exercise. He had persuaded the others that Sarah needed to be taught a lesson about her place in the military. The three had managed to determine Sarah's drop-off location by overhearing instructor communications. Instead of focusing on their own training objectives, they decided to intercept Sarah and subject her to what Thompson called additional training that would humble her and prove that women didn't belong in combat roles. Sarah had been moving through the forest for about 2 hours when she realized something was wrong. She had been carefully avoiding the obvious paths and staying in dense cover, but she kept hearing sounds that suggested she was being followed. At first, she assumed it was one of the instructor patrols, but the sounds didn't match the movement patterns she would expect from experienced soldiers. She decided to test her suspicion by changing direction suddenly and moving toward a rocky area where tracks would be harder to follow. The sounds continued, confirming that someone was indeed following her, and they weren't being very careful about concealing their presence. Sarah found a good observation point behind a large boulder and waited quietly. After about 10 minutes, she saw Thompson moving through the trees below her position. He was followed by Rodriguez and Blake, and all three were carrying zip ties and other restraint materials that weren't part of the standard exercise equipment. The realization hit Sarah like a cold wave. This wasn't part of the training exercise. Thompson and his allies had gone rogue and were planning something that could have serious consequences for everyone involved. Sarah's mind raced through her options as she watched the three men searching for her trail. She could try to avoid them entirely and continue toward the rendezvous point, but the forest was their hunting ground now, and they knew approximately where she was headed. She could try to reach one of the instructor patrols, but she wasn't sure where they were positioned, and calling out would reveal her location to Thompson's group. The third option was to confront the situation directly, but 3-against-1 odds were not favorable, especially since Thompson seemed to have lost touch with reality and normal military discipline. Sarah decided her best strategy was to continue moving toward the base while staying ahead of her pursuers. For the next hour, Sarah used every evasion technique she had learned to stay ahead of Thompson's group. She moved through the densest parts of the forest, used streams to hide her tracks, and doubled back on her own trail to confuse anyone following her. However, Thompson seemed determined to catch her, and his group was persistent in their pursuit. Finally, Sarah realized she was being herded toward a particular area of the forest. Thompson's group had split up and was using coordinated movement to cut off her escape routes. This was a more sophisticated approach than she had expected, suggesting that Thompson had planned this encounter carefully. As Sarah emerged into a small clearing, she found herself surrounded. Thompson stepped out from behind a tree directly in front of her, while Rodriguez and Blake appeared on her flanks. All three men had removed their military insignia and were carrying improvised restraints. "Well, well," Thompson said with a twisted smile. "Looks like the tough female soldier isn't so tough after all. Time for some real training about knowing your place." Sarah assessed her situation quickly. The men were positioned to prevent her from running back into the forest, and they seemed confident that they had her trapped. However, Sarah noticed that their positioning wasn't perfect, and they had underestimated her willingness to fight back. "This isn't part of the exercise." "Thompson," Sarah said firmly, "you're violating military regulations and putting everyone's career at risk. Stand down immediately." Thompson laughed harshly. Military regulations? You think hiding behind regulations will help you now? We're miles from anywhere and nobody knows where we are. It's time someone taught you that women don't belong in combat roles. Sarah realized that Thompson had completely lost touch with reality. The psychological pressure of the training, combined with his existing prejudices and resentments, had pushed him beyond rational behavior. Rodriguez and Blake looked uncomfortable but seemed committed to following Thompson's lead. When Thompson moved toward her with zip ties in his hands, Sarah reacted instinctively. Her military training kicked in, and she used a defensive move to avoid his grasp while striking back at his exposed position. The sudden resistance caught Thompson off guard, and he stumbled backward. Rodriguez and Blake immediately moved to help Thompson, but Sarah had anticipated this response. She used their momentary coordination confusion to break through their containment and run toward the densest part of the forest. However, her escape was short-lived, as Thompson quickly recovered and organized pursuit. The chase that followed was unlike anything covered in standard military training. Sarah found herself running for her safety, while her own fellow soldiers pursued her with clearly hostile intent. She could hear them crashing through the underbrush behind her, and Thompson was shouting threats and inappropriate comments. Sarah's superior physical conditioning gave her an initial advantage, but the forest terrain was rough and treacherous. She had to balance speed with caution to avoid injury that would leave her vulnerable to capture. The pursuit continued for nearly 30 minutes, before Sarah found herself trapped in a small valley with steep slopes on 3 sides. Thompson's group had successfully cornered her in a location where escape seemed impossible. As they approached, Sarah prepared to make a final stand, knowing that her military training and personal integrity were on the line. She would not allow herself to be subjected to whatever Thompson had planned. What happened next changed everything. Thompson and his allies managed to overpower Sarah through sheer numbers, despite her strong resistance. They used military restraint techniques to subdue her and then tied her to a large tree in the center of the clearing. Thompson seemed to view this as some kind of victory that proved his point about female soldiers. However, Thompson had made a critical error in his planning. In his obsession with confronting Sarah, he had forgotten about the communication devices that all soldiers carried for emergency situations. During the struggle, Sarah had managed to activate her emergency beacon, sending an automatic distress signal with her location coordinates. The signal was received at base operations, where her husband Michael was completing routine helicopter maintenance. When he heard Sarah's emergency beacon activation, every instinct told him something was seriously wrong. The exercise protocols didn't call for emergency beacons unless there was genuine danger. Michael immediately contacted the training command to report the emergency signal. When they confirmed that no emergency was scheduled for Sarah's location, Michael requested permission to conduct an immediate search and rescue mission. His commanding officer, recognizing the potential seriousness of the situation, authorized Michael to take a helicopter and investigate. As Thompson stood over Sarah tied to the tree, making speeches about teaching her a lesson, neither he nor his accomplices noticed the growing sound of helicopter rotors approaching their location. Michael had pinpointed the emergency beacon coordinates and was flying directly toward their position. Sarah heard the helicopter first and felt a surge of hope mixed with concern for her husband's safety. She knew Michael would come for her, but she also worried about what he might do when he discovered what had happened. Thompson and his allies finally noticed the approaching aircraft and began to panic, realizing that their actions were about to be discovered. 47 seconds after the helicopter sound became audible, Michael's aircraft appeared above the clearing. Through the trees, he could see Sarah tied to the tree and 3 male soldiers standing nearby. The situation was immediately clear to him, and his training as both a pilot and a husband kicked into high gear. Michael landed the helicopter in the clearing with precision that demonstrated his skill and determination. As the rotors wound down, he emerged from the aircraft with the authority of an officer and the intensity of a husband whose wife had been threatened. Thompson, Rodriguez, and Blake found themselves facing not just rescue operations, but the immediate consequences of their actions. The confrontation that followed was swift and decisive. Michael's arrival had completely changed the power dynamic in the clearing. Thompson's group, who had felt confident when facing one isolated female soldier, now found themselves confronting an experienced helicopter pilot with backup communications and the full authority of military command. Within minutes, additional personnel arrived at the scene as Michael had radioed for support during his flight. The incident quickly escalated into a full military investigation, with serious charges being considered against Thompson and his accomplices. Sarah was freed and medically evaluated, while the three men faced immediate detention and formal charges. The rescue had been completed in 47 seconds from the first sound of helicopter rotors to Sarah's freedom, but the consequences of Thompson's actions would last much longer. The incident became a case study in military training programs about the importance of maintaining discipline and respect among soldiers regardless of gender or background. Sarah completed her training program with distinction, proving once again that her place in the military was earned through competence and dedication. Michael's quick response and professional handling of the emergency rescue earned him commendation from his superiors. Thompson and his allies faced courts-martial that ended their military careers and resulted in criminal charges. The forest clearing where the incident occurred was later used as a training site for courses on military ethics and unit cohesion. Sarah and Michael continued their military service, both advancing in their careers and becoming advocates for improved training protocols that would prevent similar incidents in the future. The 47 seconds between the first sound of helicopter rotors and Sarah's rescue became a symbol of how quickly situations can change when proper support systems are in place. It also demonstrated the importance of emergency preparedness and the dedication of military personnel to protecting their fellow soldiers regardless of personal relationships.